Excellent. Thank you very much, Ken, for the invitation and also for the presentation. It's a great pleasure to being today at Cornell, although virtually. But let's hope that in the near future it will be possible to go to Cornell and then meet also colleagues like Ken and also other people working at Cornell that I also estimate a lot. So let me now share just my I have to ask you, Ken or Phil, to allow me to share my PowerPoint presentation because I'm not allowing to do that now. So you can do that for me, please.
That's done. Okay.
Yes, now I can do it. Thanks, Phil. So and now let me share my screen. Yes, because I have prepared this presentation. Then, as you can see there, it's called The Chilean Right at the Crossroads. And in fact, many of the ideas that I will develop today, as you will see, are related to some of the work that I have been doing in the last few years. As Ken was mentioning, most of my work I have been trying to do comparisons within Latin America or within Europe, or also between Latin America and Europe. And in the last few years, I'm starting to do a bit more of research of my own country, so about the case of Chile, and particularly about the situation of the Chilean right. So in the next half an hour or 40 minutes, I will give you a presentation about that. So briefly, some of the ideas that I will present today are related to other publications. So people that have read these pieces might find not very unique what I'm telling you, because part of the evidence that I will provide today are related to some of these different articles I have written, and also some to manuscript that Ken mentioned. That's an edited volume that I have been working with my friend and colleague Tim Bale, which is about the transformation of mainstream right parties in Western Europe. And in fact, part of the theories that I will present today are related to that manuscript, because I do think that the theories that have been developing in Western Europe to understand the situation of the mainstream right are indeed quite useful for understanding the situation of the Chilean right at the moment. So about the outline of my presentation, I will start very briefly with some issues of conceptualization and much more the theoretical framework that underpins my presentation. And this first part is related to a certain extent to this edited volume that I mentioned a couple of seconds ago. In the second part of the presentation, I will tell you about the evolution of the Chilean right since the transition to democracy till today. And in the third part, I will move much more to the current situation of the Chilean right, which in my opinion, is a very difficult moment for the right. And the argument that I want to develop is that indeed the Chilean right is in a critical moment. It's at the crossroads. And there are a lot of questions about how the Chilean right will move or will transform or not in the coming years. And I will wrap up at the end with a couple of concluding remarks about the future of the Chilean right and the impact of that transformation of the Chilean right for the democratic system in Chile. So without further ado, then let me start very briefly about some issues with the conceptualization. So when we talk about left and right politics, my feeling is that the best work is the classic small book of Norberto Bobbio, which is called Left and Right, The Significance of Political Distinction. And if you go to that book that was published in the early 90s, the argument of Bobbio that I fully agree with is that the right should be thought as a political ideology, which is characterized by the belief that the main inequalities within society are naturally and largely outside of the purview of the state. Something that it's important to underline is that when we are thinking about the right in this sense, there are two different dimensions that sometimes people forget. And when we are talking about inequalities, these inequalities can be in the socio-economic realm, and this has to do with to what extent the state needs to intervene to counterbalance inequalities. But inequalities are also related to sociocultural dimension. And in fact, this is getting much more common in Western European contexts, in which we see that right-wing parties are politicizing issues related to the cultural dimension rather than to the economic dimension. But I think it's important to keep in mind that, again, when we are talking about right-wing parties or right-wing politics, this issue that inequalities are natural are related to these two different dimensions. And in fact, I will present some evidence about that for the Chilean context. So if we buy that argument that this is the definition of the right, the other issue that is important to keep in mind is that we can make a distinction between two big families of right-wing politics or right-wing parties. And again, based on the European context, we know there is a distinction between mainstream right parties and far-right parties. Just to give a couple of examples, if we think in Europe, Christian democracy and conservative parties would be part of the mainstream right, whereas if we think about the far right, we have a party family that is called the populist radical right. We have a bunch of new parties that started to grow in Europe in the 80s and 90s. Think about the Front National in France or the Lega Nord, as I put there, but also Vox in Spain, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, etc. And you also have like the extreme right, which our parties are deeply undemocratic in comparison to the populist radical right. So this is an overview about all the different types of political parties that we can find in the right-wing spectrum. And the last point that I want to do about the conceptualization of that, or the theoretical underpinnings of that sort of argument, is to understand that contemporary right-wing politics are struggling between two different types of revolution. The first revolution is the so-called silent revolution, and this is the classic argument made by Ronald Inglehart already in the 70s and 80s. And his argument is because of the process of economic modernization, we are seeing a value transformation within Western European societies. And this means the rise of post-material values in contrast to material values. But at the same time, there is this argument about the other revolution, and this is the so-called silent counter-revolution. And there is this famous piece by Piero Ignasi published in the beginning of the 90s, in which he says that it is true that Western European societies or advanced democracies have seen the rise of the silent revolution, but we also have like the backlash. And the backlash is because there are certain segments of the electorate that do not feel well represented by mainstream right parties, and they start to being politicized this cultural dimension by the populist radical right or more extreme right parties. So in summary, the argument that I have been developing for Western Europe that I do think that travels very well for the Chilean context is that mainstream right parties are experiencing this tension between the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution. The silent revolution means that progressive values and liberal values are growing within societies, and this means that mainstream parties need to adapt to this new scenario in order to remain competitive. But at the same time, we are seeing the silent counter-revolution, which means that certain voters have authoritarian values and nativist ideas, which are being politicized by the populist radical right. And this is why for mainstream right parties, the contemporary situation is so challenging. Because you either go into the direction of the silent revolution or you go in the direction of the silent counter-revolution, but there is no way for mainstream right parties that they can appeal two types of voters simultaneously. Although I think that the US is a sort of a different story, but Ken knows that much better than me, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. So that's roughly the sort of theoretical framework that I'm using for understanding the Chilean right. So let's move then to the second part of the presentation. It's now trying to apply that sort of framework for the Chilean context. So if we look at the Chilean context in a comparative perspective, what is very curious about the Chilean right, it has to do with the origins of the right. And as you can see here in the pictures, this is deeply related to the authoritarian period of Augusto Pinochet, who was one of the key figures at the world level about implementing neoliberal reforms. And in fact, the only two other leaders that were similar in the sense of pushing so strong for neoliberal reforms were the cases of Margaret Thatcher in the United States and also of Ronald Reagan in the United States. The only difference, of course, is in the UK and the US, this was done through democratic means, whereas in the case of Chile, that was done in an authoritarian way. So the parties that came to power after the transition to democracy, which are mainly UDI and Renovación Nacional, they form normally a coalition, and this coalition has deep roots in this authoritarian period. It is true that there have been the development of new leaders, and in fact, in the last few years, we have seen the rise of a new party, which is called Evópoli, which is still a right-wing party. It's a sort of liberal right-wing party that tries to present itself as much more liberal than the others. And this has a lot to do with how to relate to the authoritarian past. But all these parties form part of this big coalition, which is normally called Chile Vamos, and Chile Vamos is in fact now controlling the government. So before I tell you more about the current state of the government coalition, I want to present a couple of graphs to give you a bit of a background of how Chilean society has been changing and to what extent these parties have been adapting to the changing nature of Chilean society. So the first graph I want to present here is just some basic information about the electoral results in presidential elections in post-transition Chile. And to make the story simple, I'm just adding the votes for the center left and for the center right. And if you look at this graph, the first issue that is interesting is that just after the transition to democracy, the electoral situation of the center-right was awful. And as you can see here, in fact, the center-right put forward candidates for the presidential election that they were so little competitive that they were not able to force a ballotage. And in fact, the Christian Democrats at that time were able to win the elections with more than 50% of the vote. This starts to change in 1999 when Joaquin Lavín was nominated, and he was very close to winning the election. And you can see here that from 1999 onwards, the right starts to get much more competitive. Not able to win the elections yet, but start to force a ballotage. And that was the situation in 1999 and also in 2005. And then finally, we can see a third period that starts with 2009. And this is the period of time in which the center-right for the first time is able to conquer executive power. This is Sebastián Piñera in 2009, then suffers a huge electoral loss, and then the right comes back to power in 2017, again with Sebastián Piñera. So if you see at that graph, we can identify these three periods. A first period in which the center-right is anything but competitive. Then we have a second period of time in which the center-right starts to get much more competitive. And the third period of time, which starts in 2009, in which finally the center-right is able to conquer executive office. So in the next few minutes, then, I want to give a couple of arguments about why is it that the center-right starts to get much more competitive over the years, and also why this transformation is getting much more problematic for the center-right nowadays. So in this sense, I want to start with presenting some data on the demand side. And I will go relatively fast because I think these are just very simple descriptive graphs showing some data about the evolution of Chilean society on certain issues that are related to right-wing ideas. So the first one is like data from World Value Survey, which is the classical question about what is more important to generate economic growth or environmental protection. As you can see here, over the years, you see that the blue line is going up, and this means growing support for environmental issues, which is a bit related to the argument of Ingelhard that I presented at the beginning of my presentation. But also, we can see a lot of other issues related to the economy. This is a classical question from Latino Barometro, which asks whether the privatization of economic enterprises has been beneficial for the country. And as you can see, the line that goes up is that most people disagree with that idea. And this is deeply related to the fact that the neoliberal model has been very successful in generating economic growth, but has been very unsuccessful in terms of generating more economic equality within the country. Second, another piece of evidence that is interesting also from Latino Barometro is a question whether the market economy is the only system to which Chile can become a developed country. And it's interesting to see here that most people tend to agree with that, between 50 to 60% of the population. And I think that this is crucial because what Chileans want nowadays, and this is something that I will develop further in a couple of minutes, what Chileans are demanding, it's not the implementation of Cuba, North Korea, or Venezuela. Chileans just want a sort of social democratic model. And this is why, at the end of the day, they're in favor of the free market, but they want to generate a safety net. And this is a message that for the right-wing bloc is not very easy to accommodate, precisely because of this whole inheritance from the neoliberal model related to the Pinochet dictatorship. So a bit more of evidence related to different data from the demand side and how different ideas play a role in contemporary Chilean society. This is another question coming from UNDP surveys that are, in my opinion, extremely interesting, because this is a question that asks whether the population disagrees with the idea that it's fair that those who can pay more should have access to better health and education for the children, which at the end of the day, if you want, is a sort of measure for to what extent do you agree with a neoliberal economic model. And as you can see here, there is growing amount of people that disagrees with that idea, that they think Chileans growingly that it's unfair that if you have more money, you should have access to better health and education, which again, it doesn't mean that you want to have North Korea or Venezuela. What Chileans want is a sort of social democratic model. And finally, let me also present some additional data to this cultural dimension of the left and right-wing axis within Chilean society. This is a question from the Latin American Public Opinion Project that asks whether people agree or disagree with with gay marriage. And as you can see, this is a scale that grows from 10 to 0. And you see also growing support, which means that increasingly Chilean society is getting more and more in favor of this cultural dimension, is getting more liberal in the cultural dimension. And finally, some data also from World Values Survey that asks the same type of question. This is support for abortion, divorce, and homosexuality. And also you see a line that goes up from being very conservative at the beginning of transition to democracy. And if we take the last measures from the World Values Survey, we see growing support for this cultural dimension. And the final graph that I want to present into that is the same type of evidence, but in comparative perspective with other countries. And the countries that I'm putting here is just like big countries within Latin America and also the United States. It may be a bit difficult to read all these different lines that you see there in the graphs. But what is interesting is you look Chile at the beginning. So the first measure that we have at the beginning of transition of democracy, Chile was one of the most conservative countries within the Americas, if you consider also the US. And if you look at the last figure that we have, the last measure from the World Value Survey, we see that Chile is nowadays one of the more progressive societies within the Americas. So in some issues, even more progressive than the United States. For example, if you consider the issue of divorce, for example, there's much more support in Chile than the United States. And the same applies, for example, for homosexuality. So in a relatively short period of time, we're talking about 20 to 30 years, Chilean society has experienced a huge value transformation. So in this sense, I hope that the evidence that I have presented here helps to underpin this argument that Chilean society has been gradually becoming more liberal or more leftist in both the cultural and the economic dimension. So how can we explain this value transformation within Chilean society? And of course, there are many different arguments that we need to consider, but in my opinion, there are two factors that are crucial to explain that. First one is a classical argument from Ronald Inglehart, and if you want, this is a classic argument from modernization theory, which tells you that when you have growing economic development for a long period of time, this will generate gradually, not automatically, but gradually, will generate a value transformation within society. And this is a silent revolution argument that Ronald Inglehart has been developing in the last few years that applies in a very well way for the West European context. And I do think that also applies very well for the Chilean context. But there is a second argument that is also very relevant, and Ken Roberts has also developed some publications into that. And the other side of the story has to do with the repoliticization of different types of inequalities by new social movements that have been emerging in Chile in the last decade. The social movements have been politicizing both the cultural and the economic dimension of being a left-wing citizen, so to say. We started with the student movement that was very big during the first Piñera government, but then the feminist movement started to be very important. We also have the so-called No Más AFP movement, which is a movement against the pension system, the fully privatized pension system that we have in Chile. So if we go back now to right-wing politics, I think that one of the ideas that I want to develop to close this part of my presentation is that the mainstream right in Chile, so the UDI, Renovación Nacional, and Evópoli, the three main parties that we have in Chile, or the coalition of parties that is called Chile Vamos, has not been blind to this process. And in fact, they have been trying to adapt to this new scenario, which is quite challenging for a right-winger. Because if you're a right-wing politician, you realize that Chilean society is moving into a direction that is not the one that you would like to. But if you want to remain competitive, the only way in which you can remain competitive is to try to adapt to these new scenarios. So, and this is why I want to close this part of my presentation with the transformation from within the Chilean right by using some data that I will present in the next graph. And this is data now on the supply side, no on the demand side. So if you want in the Q&A, we can talk more about the details about the data, but this comes from the so-called Manifesto project. This is a huge enterprise based in Europe by different scholars that what they try to do is to put together all the party manifestos, and they code the party manifestos, and they generate a so-called Riley index, a left-right index, that is composed by different components of being of how parties can position themselves in the left and right-wing agenda. This index goes from plus 100, which would be the absolute right wing, if you want, to minus 100, which would be the maximum leftist party that you can see within in a comparative nature. And the graph that I'm putting here shows the data for the three parties that, in my opinion, were the key promoters of neoliberal ideas. And this is how I started my presentation. I'm thinking here about the Republican Party in the United States, the Conservative Party in the UK, and I'm putting also the case of Chile. For the case of Chile, we only have data since the transition to democracy, because before that we didn't have elections in Chile. But you can see here that the first two measures that we have, 1989 and 1993, the party manifestos of Chilean parties, of the Chilean coalitions, are almost identical in terms of the left-right axis than the programs developed by the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom and by the Republican Party. And if you remember, for these 2 years, the results, the electoral results for the presidents, the right-wing president, was awful. They got around 25 to 30% of the vote. So the situation started to change in the election of 1999. And if you see the graph here, you see that the right wing moderates its policy program. And this is Joaquin Lavín, who develops a program that detached from the origins of this neoliberal agenda, and he starts to put much more emphasis on the social dimension, on the economic dimension, not necessarily on the cultural dimension, but on the economic one. And if you see, then the right goes again a bit more to the right, but then it moderates again with the program of Evelyn Matei. That's the election of 2013. As you can see, also the Republican Party in the United States is fairly constant, and in fact, it's an extremely right-wing party. And we have had the discussion with Ken in other times, and I would say, in fact, it's nowadays anything but a mainstream right party. It's very clear, precisely not with Trump and with the results, that it's moving towards a far-right party. Whereas the Conservative Party in the UK has been also moderating. And the fascinating story of the Chilean right, again, is that started as conservative or as radical as these other parties, but then slowly moderated over time. But also, this is the connection to the last part of my presentation, if we think about the current situation, starts to get much more difficult. And if you see 2017, Sebastián Piñera develops a program that moves again back to the right. In fact, the program of Sebastián Piñera in 2017 is more to the right than to the program of Theresa May and David Cameron in the United Kingdom. So the key question then is, why is it that if the mainstream right in Chile started to moderate over time, in the last year, in the last presidential election, Sebastián Piñera decided to move further to the right back? And this has to do with the appearance of José Antonio Caz, someone that I will present in a minute. This is a politician that comes from the UDI, but who started to develop his new political platform. And the idea that I want to develop in the next minutes that I have left is that the mainstream right now in Chile is struggling to find a balance between, on the one hand, moderating, adapting to the silent revolution, or moving to the adaptation towards the silent counter-revolution. So the argument that I presented at the beginning for the mainstream right in Europe. So I still have like, I suppose, 10 minutes, so let me go then to the current situation of the Chilean right and to further develop that argument about the tension that the Chilean right is experiencing today. So to understand that better, the key figure is here somewhat that I already mentioned before, and his name is José Antonio Cast. He's a politician who had a long-term trajectory in the Unión Demócrata Independiente, so the main right-wing party within the right-wing bloc. But in the 2017 election, he decided to go out of the UDI and to create his own electoral platform. And to the surprise of many, including myself, he was able to get approximately 10% of the vote, which is not a bad result for someone who is like a sort of a newcomer, although he was part of the political system, but he was not very well known before he started his electoral platform. And in 2019, he decided to build his own political party, which is called Acción Republicana. You can see there the logo. Those who are familiar with the West European context will realize that, in fact, the logo of Acción Republicana is exactly the same than the Front National in France. It's a copy and paste. And this has to do with the fact that Acción Republicana is indeed a populist radical right party, quite similar to populist radical right parties in Western Europe. And in fact, he has very good relationship with Santiago Abascal, who is the main leader of Vox, the populist radical right party that established itself in Spain in the last two parliamentary elections. And he also has very good relationships with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. So I think that it's crucial to understand the figure of José Antonio Cast to grasp what is going on with the Chilean right at the moment. So, and the argument that I want to develop now is that although it is true that the Chilean center-right has experienced an increasing programmatic moderation over time, remember the graph that I presented with the manifesto data, the second administration of Sebastián Piñera has been quite ambivalent on the issue of moderation. And this ambivalent position of Piñera, that sometimes he tries to please one faction and sometimes he tries to please the other faction, help us to understand the social uprising of last year. I think that everybody knows the story of Chile, that the last year we had huge demonstration that started with something very small, with a change in the price for the metro, for the tube in Santiago, but this started to grow very, very fast within the whole country, and we started to see massive protests, not only in Santiago, but in many other regions of the country. And the first reaction of Sebastián Piñera was to hear José Antonio Cast and the radical right, so to say. In fact, many people will remember the famous speech in which Sebastián Piñera gave a couple of days after the upheaval started, in which he said that in this moment Chile is at war. And this sounds a bit like the right in the 60s and the 70s, almost like the military, because this means being at war with your own population. And the understanding of Sebastián Piñera and his close advisors at the beginning was much more that this was just an issue of social, of security. And they just wanted to have like harsh measures to control what is going on. And they thought that then everything will back to normal. And in fact, it's backfired because this was a massive demonstration against social inequality. And one of the consequences of these repressive measures was that even more people went out to the streets. And there's this famous day in which more than 1 million people went to the streets only in Santiago de Chile. If we probably add up people within the country, we're talking about the biggest demonstration that Chile has seen. I'm not sure if in its whole history, but at least since the transition to democracy in the 1990s. So the consequence of that social uprising was that Sebastián Piñera needed to adapt to the pressures from below. And the way in which he adapted is to sign this agreement for social peace and a new constitution. This was done by the political class as a whole, but Sebastián Piñera was in favor at the end of the day. He didn't have another option, to be honest, about pushing for that sort of solution. And this solution, this sort of agreement that was signed on November 15, 2019, set up like a sort of institutional process about a referendum to ask whether we want to have the constitution or not. This is the so-called referendum de entrada. Then a second process about drafting a new constitution, and finally a new referendum at the end of the process in which people will have to decide whether they want this new constitution or not. Those of you who are familiar with the Chilean context probably know that referendum took place a couple of weeks ago. That was at the end of October. Originally, the referendum was thought for the end of April, but because of the pandemic, that was postponed for the end of October. And the Chilean citizenry had two options. The first ballot, as you can see here, we had to decide whether we want to have a new constitution or not. This was the apruebo or rechazo vote. And the second ballot asked whether the new constitution should be written by a sort of a constituent assembly, so an entity that will work only for that purpose, or whether that should be drafted by an entity that will be composed by members of parliament and also by for people that were elected only for that purpose. So the result of the referendum was the following. For those of you, again, who are not familiar with the Chilean context, was a massive landslide. So almost 80% of the Chilean population voted in favor of changing on the constitution, and almost 80% of the population voted for the most progressive option, the Constitutional Convention. So why I'm giving you this evidence? Because I think that this evidence supports, one, again, the argument that I have been developing before, that Chilean society has been growingly and gradually becoming much more liberal or more leftist, both in the cultural dimension and the economic dimension. And the Chilean right is struggling to adapt to this situation. So going back to the issue about the constitutional referendum, I think that the evidence, the massive landslides, help us to argue that Chile is not really polarized about the issue of changing constitution and about the necessity of undertaking structural reforms. Again, structural reforms doesn't mean trying to contract North Korea, Cuba, or Venezuela. It's just trying to move towards a social democratic model. Nevertheless, and I think this is part of the problem, there is this graph that went viral right after the election, which shows the different neighborhoods within Santiago. And the neighborhoods that are in red are the only neighborhoods within Santiago in which a majority of the population voted against the constitutional referendum. And these three neighborhoods there are Vitacura, Las Condes, and Novarnechea, and this is the wealthiest neighborhoods within Santiago. So, and this shows that the majority of the Chilean population wants to change the existing economic model and development model, so to say, but there is a fraction of society that is opposed, that is against that. And this is mainly the elite of the country. I'm thinking mainly here about the economic elite or the very wealthy. And in this sense, I do think that the result of the referendum and the constitutional process that will start again, because next year we'll have the election for the Constituent Assembly, represents a huge challenge to the right, because the right is suffering this growing tension that I have been trying to develop during my presentation, this tension between moderation and radicalization. So I already talked for almost 35 minutes, so let me move now to the last slide. So these are my concluding remarks, and after that, of course, we can open up the discussion for reactions and comments from the audience. So the first idea that I want to develop in this concluding remarks is about the future of José Antonio Caz and Acción Republicana. So my feeling, and we know that we are very bad about doing predictions, but this is my prediction for the Chilean context and my prediction about the evolution of this radical right in the Chilean context. And my feeling is that we shouldn't expect a major electoral success of José Antonio Caz. This means that probably the party is going to establish itself and it might be able to get 10 to 15% of the vote, but I think it's quite difficult that the party can get more votes than 10 to 15% of the electorate, which is quite similar than the West European context. If you look at populist radical right parties within Western Europe, most of those parties mobilize between 10 to 20% of the electorate. There are a couple of exceptions within Western Europe, but in most countries, it's a small minority of the population that votes for that party. Why I do think that this is going to be the case for Chile? First of all, because I think that economic issues or material values are still very crucial in the country. And this argument is being reinforced by the pandemic. The pandemic has had a deep economic consequence in Chile and Latin America, and this means that economic issues are going to be even more relevant in the next few years. And again, the agenda of the populist radical right is much more related to the cultural dimension rather than to the economic dimension. Second argument about why I don't think that José Antonio Caz and Acción Republicana are going to be that successful is because social movements have come to stay in Chile. I don't think that this is something that will disappear in the near future, quite the opposite. I do think that during the constitutional process that we will see in the next few years, the social movements are going to be activated again. And the social movements are demanding, are pushing for these structural reforms, remember, in both in the economic and in the cultural dimension. And the third argument, and I don't have empirical data to prove that, although I'm running a survey at the moment and I hope to have some electoral data at the end of the year, I do think that the negative partisanship towards José Antonio Caz or Acción Republicana is extremely high. In other words, I think that a big chunk of the Chilean population dislikes that sort of party and that sort of leader. And this is why I do think that there should be a clear electoral ceiling for the rise of that sort of party and José Antonio Caz. Again, I think that the party will establish itself, that will make a lot of noise, but I don't expect that the party will get more than 10, 15, or 20% of the vote. So in this sense, I think that the situation of Chile is quite similar to the situation of many mainstream right parties in Western Europe and also in other places of the world, in which we are seeing this growing tension between moderation and radicalization. And this means that for me, the crucial question is not so much what will happen with José Antonio Caz and Acción Republicana, but much more what will happen with the other right-wing parties. And here I just have a couple of open and research questions about that. So the first crucial question for me, and I don't have an answer because this is an ongoing issue, is whether the right will stay united in the short term and the midterm. So the first election that we'll have that is a crucial one is for the Constituent Assembly. And there are already some right-wing actors there saying we have to do a cordon sanitaire against José Antonio Caz. And in fact, there are some leaders within the right, mainly those leaders of Evópoli, which is the much more liberal faction within the mainstream right. They're saying we need to put a clear difference with José Antonio Caz, and he needs to build his own electoral constituency, and that should be a different than ours, so to say. But there is also true, there are also some leaders within the right at the moment, mainly within the UDI, they are saying we need to build a coalition with José Antonio Caz. And this is an ongoing battle, and I think this is a crucial one. The second one is Christian democracy. If you look Christian democracy in a comparative perspective, particularly in the Western European context, Christian democratic parties are mainstream right parties. But Chile, it's an odd case because the Christian democracy has made an alliance, an historical alliance with the Socialist Party, which is an awkward situation in a comparative perspective. And in fact, if you do a zoom in at the Christian Democratic Party in Chile, this is a party that is very divided, that it has a right-wing faction and a left-wing faction. My feeling is probably the Christian Democratic Party in Chile will split. And if this really happens, it could be that then the mainstream right will try to get some of those voters and those figures to rebuild itself into a new type of coalition or party brand, so to say. And of course, the last and final question is whether can Chile really transition towards a social democratic model? I still remain hopeful about that, but as I presented in the previous graph with the massive rejection of the approval referendum by the very wealthy, this is still a very problematic issue within Chilean society. And this is why I do think there are reasons why we can remain confident that Chile will move towards a direction, but there is a lot of opposition, particularly from those very wealthy within the country. And of course, this has an impact, again, on the agenda of the mainstream right in Chile. And I think that I already spoke for 40 minutes, so thank you very much for your patience. And I hope that you found the presentation interesting. And now I will stop sharing the screen so that we can probably start the debate between us.
Let me just ask you, Cristobal, if you could say a few words of, comparing the populist radical right, the emergence of caste in Chile, because I agree with you that there seem to be sort of a ceiling constraints on his ability and his party's ability to to grow in the Chilean context. That is quite different from what we've seen in Brazil with the rise of Bolsonaro, who, of course, was elected president and clearly a similar kind of leader. So, could you maybe tell us why you see Chile as being different than Brazil? What differentiates the two cases in terms of the political space for that kind of far right alternative?
Well, and this is indeed a very good question, Ken. And my feeling is Brazil is the exception rather than the rule within Latin America. There is a whole debate about whether the populist radical right is a global phenomenon, and I would say yes, it's a global phenomenon. It started originally in Western Europe, but then spread all over to Eastern Europe. We also have the extreme right now in the US, also in government with Donald Trump, and it's getting bigger in Latin America. But again, in Latin America, I think that Brazil is the exception rather than the rule. So why is it that Bolsonaro was able to conquer executive power at the end of the day, and why I do think that Chile is different? And of course, there are many different reasons, but I mean, one of the first arguments that we need to consider is that Bolsonaro came to power before a huge economic crisis. We have to think that when Dilma was in power, the GDP per capita of Brazil went down by roughly 4% for 2 consecutive years. So that was a massive economic crisis, and it generated a lot of anxiety within the Brazilian population. But also, we also know that in the Brazilian case, what is very important to consider, it has a lot to do with issues related to the corruption scandals. And those corruption scandals affected the whole political class. And I think we had something similar in Chile, but not as harsh as it was the situation in the case of Brazil. So, and this is why I do think that Brazil, it was like the sort of perfect situation in which a populist radical right leader had the possibility of getting so many votes for conquering executive power. But I do think still that in Chile, although parties are much weaker than before, they still are able to a certain extent to structure the political game. And this is why the space for a political outsider is diminished. I mean, there is some space, and this is why at the end of the day, Cast was able to get 10 to 15% of the vote. But again, it's difficult to imagine for me that he will be able to get more than that.
Okay, thank you. So let's go ahead and bring in some other questions from the audience. And again, let me encourage those of you that are listening in the audience, if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and use the Q&A function to send in a question. We have one that has come in from Mauricio Canals. It says, many thanks for this. This is very interesting. I have a couple of questions. First, parties don't need a good electoral performance to influence policies, such as the UKIP in Britain. Do you think Acción Republicana could punch above its weight, and how much so? And then following that, the Chilean far right also has an economic ideology, diminished taxes and political expenses. How much do you think that could influence the population to favor Acción Republicana?
Yes, I mean, these are two excellent questions, and these are related to some of the work that I have been doing on the populist radical right in Western Europe. And I think that Mauricio is absolutely right in saying that although these parties don't necessarily get massive support, remember, most of these parties can 5, 10 to 15% of the population, they are very successful in terms of agenda setting. They push the whole country, so to say, to debate about certain things that are not necessarily the key issues at the beginning of the election, but after the election, they start to get the most relevant issues. And this has to do a lot with immigration. And the example that Mauricio mentions, UKIP, is an excellent one. I mean, UKIP didn't have anything but stellar electoral results. To a certain extent, it's related to the electoral system in the UK, but UKIP was able to push forward the idea of having the referendum. And here comes the main mistake of the mainstream right. I mean, David Cameron, who is the guy who in fact tried to moderate the Conservative Party, he decided to run the referendum, which was at the end of the day a huge mistake. So, and this is why I think that the question of Mauricio is a very interesting one. And although I think that probably Acción Republicana will not become the biggest party in Chilean politics at all, and will be able to get 10 to 15% of the vote, the key question is how the mainstream right is going to decide. If the mainstream right decides to adapt to the populist radical right and start to use the same ideas of Acción Republicana, this is a very threatening scenario. because this means that Acción Republicana will make a lot of noise, but at the same time will have a policy impact because it will force the mainstream right to move towards the silent counter-revolution. But again, my feeling is because the Chilean society is demanding the structural transformation, I think this would be a very problematic approach for the mainstream right. And I think the way ahead for the mainstream right for remaining competitive is to moderate, and it's to adapt to the silent revolution, which means probably adopting some liberal reforms in the cultural sense and also in the economic sense. For example, one of the key figures at the moment, who is the Ministry of Defense, he has been saying that the role model for him is Angela Merkel. And he's saying Angela Merkel in Germany is doing the right thing. She's defending the welfare state, and she's adopting a sort of progressive approach, although she's still a conservative. But of course, for the UDI, I mean, Angela Merkel is almost like Fidel Castro, because the UDI is too to the right. So, but this is the tension that the party is experiencing at the moment. And again, to respond to Mauricio, I think the key question is what will happen to the mainstream right. And very shortly about the second question of Mauricio related to the economic ideology, I think this is again the big problem for Acción Republicana. If you look at the policy platform of Acción Republicana, it's an extremely neoliberal party. I mean, similar to Bolsonaro in this sense. Much more neoliberal than Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump is not really neoliberal. I mean, in some issues, yes, but in others, not. And the problem of Chilean society at the moment, and this it's reinforced by the pandemic, is that people want to have a sort of social democratic contract. And the program that José Antonio Cast is developing is very far away from that. And this is why, again, I do think that there is a clear limit to the agenda that José Antonio Cast is developing. It would be different if José Antonio Cast adopts the approach of the mainstream of the populist radical right in Western Europe. And in fact, the populist radical right in Western Europe is very much in favor of the welfare state, but only wants a welfare state for the native population. But because José Antonio Cast is a neoliberal, so to say, he's very far away from that agenda. Again, because he still has his neoliberal program, this remains his electoral ceiling to that sort of project, I would say.
Okay, thank you. I also have a question that's come in from my colleague, Gustavo Flores Macias. Says, thank you, Cristobal, for your talk. Immigration has been a major topic for the European populist radical right. How salient is immigration for the Chilean right?
Well, I think that here the theories for Western Europe applies very well for the Chilean context. And what we know from Western Europe, and this is a bit the paradox, when the economic situation is very good, immigration starts to get a very salient issue because people are not really worried about the material dimension and they start to get much more worried about the cultural dimension. But when the economic situation is very bad, then in fact, this cultural dimension gets less relevant. This is why at the end of the day, for example, in Spain, we saw the rise of Podemos. I mean, the Great Recession activated much more these left-wing sentiments rather than the issue of immigration. Whereas the Great Recession that had not a major impact in the northern countries of Western Europe, in those countries, the issue of immigration started to get more salient. And I think that sort of argument applies very well for the Chilean context. I think that immigration is relevant for the Chilean population, but in comparison to other issues, it's not the key issue. The main problem in Chile at the moment, it has to do with inequality, it has to do with economic redistribution, it has to do now with unemployment precisely, or more than precisely, reinforced because of the pandemic. And also because we have these progressive social movements that are repoliticizing inequalities. And this is why I don't think that immigration is going to become the key issue. I do think that immigration is relevant, but it's not as salient as other dimensions. And this is why, again, I think that if José Antonio Cast wants to push that dimension, there are clear limits to what extent he can succeed through that way. And one short comment into that, something interesting about José Antonio Cast and reading his program is that he doesn't put that much emphasis on immigration, but he has a lot of emphasis on the issue of the Mapuche population in Chile. So he's a nativist, but in a different way. So he's a nativist not only because he says, I don't want immigrants, but because he has a very peculiar understanding about what does it mean to be Chilean, and Chilean is not accepting the Mapuche population. And I think this might be a selling point for José Antonio Cast for some groups within Chilean society They are very afraid about what is going on in La Araucanía and also to granting rights to indigenous population within Chile.
Thank you. We have a message that has come in from a Brazilian Cornell alum who says that during yesterday's municipal elections in Brazil, most of the mayoral candidates in big cities supported by Bolsonaro performed terribly. For example, in the city of Sao Paulo, the candidate who had received Bolsonaro's blessing came in fourth place with 10.5%. So it's an interesting observation. It may, have something to say to us about sort of the electoral vibrancy of the far right.
Yes.
Okay, let me, if you want to comment on that, go ahead, Cristobal. Otherwise,
very shortly, I think I reinforce a bit the idea that we were discussing at the beginning with your question, Ken, about Bolsonaro in Brazil. I think the vote for Bolsonaro in Brazil, the way in which I read it, it was, of course, people were voting for a far-right politician, but people were voting against the establishment. That was the main thing. So they were voting, they were trying to oust of power the elite of the country, which doesn't mean that they were necessarily 100% in favor of the project of Bolsonaro. And this is different from the United States with Trump. I mean, so now you have in the election in the United States, 70 million people voted for Trump despite his horrible management of the pandemic. I mean, this is something completely different than what is happening in Brazil. People now are fed up with Bolsonaro, and probably he's not going to be reelected. But this shows again that people that voted for Bolsonaro at the beginning were not necessarily in favor of a far-right project. They were against the establishment. And I think this is a completely different situation than the situation in the United States. And this is why, again, I think that Bolsonaro is the exception within Latin America. And what we can probably expect in Brazil, although it's still it's moving, it's difficult to predict, but I wouldn't be surprised if Bolsonaro disappears from the scene and we'll see a going back of the old party, so to say, or they will need to adapt to this new situation.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that's come in from one of our graduate fellows, Pablo Scuticio. It says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Political leaders often have to mediate between a moderate and a more radical faction within their party or coalition. What makes this balancing act so difficult in Piñera's current administration?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the first, there is an institutional argument to that. There was a reform to the electoral system in Chile. We had like this binominal electoral system in the past, which was a very peculiar system that at the end of the day helped the creation of electoral coalitions. But we have now a new electoral system that it's much more representative than the previous one. And this means that for a party like José Antonio Caz, he knows that he's able to pull 10% of the vote. He will have approximately 10% of the vote in Congress. So, and this means from the institutional perspective, for political leaders now, it makes sense to build their own political parties, although they will not necessarily win executive office because they can generate a lot of noise and can try to push the agenda into a certain direction. So this is the institutional argument. But the other argument that I think it's probably even more relevant than the institutional one is that within the right-wing bloc in Chile, we have these two different souls, so to say. There is this very nice interview after the result of the referendum that I presented. So imagine if you're a right-winger and you were against the constitutional referendum, and if you see the results, this is a huge problem for you because you know that 80% of the population is against you and you're only representing 20% of the population. So, and the president of the UDI, the right-wing party, Jacqueline Van Rysselberghe, she got an interview on that day of the referendum, and the journalist asked her about what's her interpretation of the results. And she said, well, this is wonderful. We are going to be the party of the 20%. So, but this is one option. If you want to be the party of the 20%, you will never win executive office. So, and this is one option. But the other option is the one of the moderates who are saying we want to remain competitive. And the only way of remaining competitive is to adapt to this new scenario. And this is why I do think that mediating between these two factions is getting more and more difficult because it's very difficult to build agreements between them. So one of those factions, the more liberal, is going to say, we are fine with having a sort of social democratic model, whereas the other one will defend the neoliberal one. So reaching an agreement between these two factions, I think, it will become slowly a nightmare for the center right in Chile.
Okay. So we have a question that has come in from one of our undergraduate students, George Defendini. He says, how have the Chilean left engaged with the social protests, and do you anticipate their relation to protests will impact the success of the Chilean right in elections? And can I also add an extension of that? Do you, as Chile moves beyond this constitutional assembly, whatever they end up creating, but do you think does the established Chilean left reassert itself? In other words, the Socialist Party and the PPD, or do you envision the new Frente Amplio or some other movement-based party coming out of the protest movement becoming the dominant force on the political left in Chile?
Well, these are two big and interesting questions. I mean, related to the first one, I think that, and Ken already anticipated that in his questions, is the problem of the Chilean left nowadays is divided in many different factions, but to put it very simple, we have like the two factions, like the old guard, which is mainly the Socialist Party, and we have the Frente Amplio. So, which is similar, if you want, to the situation in Spain, in which you have like the old PSOE versus Podemos. And the conflict between these two different lefts are, on the one hand, generational. I think the Frente Amplio is much younger people, so they're mainly coming from the university, so to say, whereas the Socialist Party is much more the old guard, so these are older guys that were in government before. But the divide is not only generational, I think it's also related to the policy dimension. In fact, the Frente Amplio is much more progressive. They really want to build a social democratic model similar to the European welfare state, whereas many people within the Socialist Party still want to have like a hybrid model. I mean, that still gives a lot of space to the free market. And this is a big tension. But I think the question of George is much more related to the engagement of the Chilean left with the social protest. And what is fascinating about the Chilean case study, I think, is that these protests were very autonomous from the political class. And in fact, there is no one single leader that could claim that that person is representing the people in the Chilean context. Because the protests were so massive. We're talking about millions of people on the streets demanding many different things. If you have seen pictures about the protests, there were people protesting about the pension system, people about the education system, people about reproductive rights. So there are many different agendas there. And this is why it's very difficult for a party, I would say, in part because parties are deeply delegitimized because of corruption scandal and stuff like that, but also for the new parties to try to develop a sort of umbrella that gives a voice to all these different sectors within society. So, and in this sense, to make a long story short, I still think that protests are relatively autonomous from political parties in the Chilean context. And I do think that during the constitutional process, I do think that protests will reappear. So if during the constitutional process, for example, we start to see a push to try to adopt conservative policies for the new constitutions, I bet that social movements will reappear and they will try to put pressure on the streets to try to move the debate within the Constituent Assembly into one direction. So in this sense, I think that social movements are still very active in Chilean society, although we will see what happens in the next few years. And related to the question of Ken again, so and the future, so to say, of the center left, I think it's very difficult to anticipate what is going to happen. I think in the short term, I think the crucial issue is whether all left-wing parties are going to be able to develop a common electoral platform, so the same list for the Constituent Assembly. I think this is the first challenge. And if they're not able to do that, and there are good reasons to think that they will not be able to do that, this is a very bad starting point. Because if, of course, they put a lot of very different electoral lists, this will diminish the power of the left or center-left forces within the Constituent Assembly. And by contrast, if they're able to try to build a common electoral list with many center-left forces, so the Socialist Party and also people within the Frente Amplio, this is a good sign that there might be a chance in the near future of building a coalition similar to the one that we are seeing in Spain between Podemos and PSOE. So in this sense, I do think that the elections that we'll see next year are going to be crucial in this regard.
Okay, thanks. Got time for just a little bit more, a couple more questions. Gustavo Flores Macias, a question here. I've heard Chile experts characterize Renovación Nacional as having occupied the space in the spectrum that the Christian Democrats used to occupy, especially after Piñera's first term in office. Would you agree?
Fascinating question. I do think, and also tell my students, I mean, people need to write the story about the Christian Democratic Party in Chile after the 1990s. I mean, we have very little research about that. Yeah. And I think it's fascinating because the Christian Democratic Party started like the success story in Chile, and now it's a dying species. And it has to do a bit with this value transformation that I presented at the beginning. So Chilean society is slowly getting more liberal. So this means for the Christian Democratic Party, it's quite difficult to represent those voters who are more liberal on the moral dimension, for example, issues related to gay marriage, abortion, etc. And what is happening is within Renovación Nacional, and I think Renovación Nacional is deeply divided into that. You have two factions again. You have a faction that it's a liberal faction. So the current Minister of Defense is the one who is representing that faction, who is saying, I want to follow the path of Angela Merkel, which means I'm fine with a mild version of the welfare state, and I'm fine probably with some mild reforms in the cultural dimension. But at the same time, you have within Renovación Nacional a deeply conservative faction, which is now expressed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alamant, who is saying, no, I don't want to have a welfare state at all, and I'm fine with having defending conservative values. And these two factions are within the same party. So I would say that the situation of Renovación Nacional now it's similar to the situation of Christian Democratic Party at the beginning of the transition, in the sense that Renovación Nacional is the most voted party at the moment in the last election, but it's a party that is deeply divided into two different factions. And if we see the story of Christian democracy, at the beginning of the transition, they were very strong, but afterwards they started to diminish because they were not able to find a good balance between these two different factions. And this is exactly what could happen to Renovación Nacional in the coming years.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one final question here. It's come in from Eric Lopez. It says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Recently, an overwhelming victory for the Approved campaign has put Chile on a 2-year path to a new constitution. But with presidential and legislative elections coming up next November, the Piñera government isn't in a position to lead this constitution writing process, given the absence of clear political leadership and the fact that the composition of the assembly is still unknown, and it's not clear whether political parties will be able to control the process. How will this heighten tensions between right-wing and centrist parties and left-wing parties in the coming year?
Well, I think that Piñera is a dead man walking. I mean, he's not able to govern at all. I mean, because his approval rating is roughly 10%. I mean, he's not a figure. He's not seen as a key figure within the center right anymore. In part because of his very bad approval ratings, but also because he's not able to manage the tension between these different factions. And I do think that this is still relatively under control, but as soon as the electoral process starts, and next year we're going to have plenty of elections. We're going to have local elections, we are going to have elections for the Constituent Assembly, then we are going to have elections from Parliament and for the presidency. I think it's going to be very clear that people will try to, particularly right-wing politicians, they will try to detach from Piñera because he's not an asset at all. I mean, he will probably finish his government. I don't think that will happen something like De la Rúa in Argentina or what we are seeing in Peru, because the Chilean context is different. But the real power that Piñera has, it's very, very small. I mean, he will finish again his administration, but I think the real battles are nowadays not at the executive office. It's much more what is going on in parliament, and what is more interesting is the coming elections that we'll see next year. These are going to be the real battlegrounds for the center right.
Okay. Well, because you're so concise, I'm going to squeeze in one final question that I'm going to pose because I want to hear your thoughts on this, and it's to force you to step out of your Chilean, Latin American comfort zone. I know you know an awful lot about the United States, but you've been talking about the tensions within the Chilean right and how Piñera in some ways responding to the social changes taking place and kind of the social liberalization in the cultural sphere, as well as the social demands to address problems of economic inequality. And so there was this gradual moderation that took place within sort of the mainstream center right, but at the same time you have this new far right that is mobilizing. But you talked about how you think that's influence is contained and has an electoral ceiling. How do we explain the United States, where the kind of far right that you're talking about is able to compete for the median voter? In other words, to compete to be a political majority, just lost an election, but lost an election with 48% of the vote. And you talked about how in Western Europe, this brand of politics tends to be contained at 10 to 15%. And in Chile, it's contained at 10 to 15%. What makes the US different? What allows that political project to compete for the median voter in the United States?
Well, that's the biggest question, so to say. And I say the guy who is able to answer that, I will say, will get an article that is going to be highly cited, so to say, because I think it's a big question at the moment for understanding the current situation of the far right in a comparative perspective. So my 2 cents into that is that the United States is a very peculiar country in a comparative perspective. And this probably helps us to understand why the Trump phenomenon is possible at the end of the day. And I think that Trump is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, this is something important to keep in mind. If you remember the graph that I presented about the party manifesto showing the position of the Republican Party in the United States, is extremely constant over time with a very right-wing position. If you look at mainstream right parties in Western Europe, they are not as radical as the Republican Party in the United States. And you know that much better than me. I think that probably even before Trump, it was a mistake to categorize the Republican Party as a mainstream right party. I think the party started way before Trump to radicalize with issues related to the economy, of course, because of the neoliberal revolution, but also on the cultural dimension. And I think a big mistake is that many people consider for a long period of time the Republican Party in the United States as a mainstream right party, and I think it's not. It's a far right party, which means we need to use other conceptual tools for understanding that sort of party family that is different from the mainstream right. But for me, the fascinating issue, and this is the crucial question, is why is it that that party gets like 50% of the electorate? I mean, this is not what is happening in Germany. This is not what is happening even in Austria or in other countries of the world. So why is it that Trump and the Republican Party get so massive support? And I think that part of the explanation, I mean, this is only part, it has to do with this issue of positive and negative partisanship that makes the US context so different. And I think there are many US American scholars who have been showing this whole argument about affective polarization, which means at the end of the day, if you identify as a Democrat, you automatically hate the Republican Party and the other way around. And this is for me the most curious thing, because I do think that many people that voted for Trump probably don't really like his agenda, but because many people dislike the Democratic Party, automatically end up voting for the Republican Party. And I think that sort of scenario, it's very difficult to imagine in multi-party system in Western Europe. Because if you dislike the Front National in France, or if you dislike the Alternative für Deutschland, you will vote definitely for you have many different options to which you can vote for. Whereas in the case of the US, you have like this bipolar system that is highly polarized, and this makes the battleground completely different. But also for me, the other issue that it's very problematic and curious is that in theory, the argument of Engelhardt should apply to the United States, because it's a country in which you have economic growth. The data also shows that you have growing liberal values, but nevertheless, 50% of the country is voting for a far-right politician. And I do think that we need better theories for understanding the peculiarities of the US system. Again, I think it has to do a bit with this issue of affective polarization, and it has also to do with this transformation of the mainstream right. So there is a moment on time, I don't know which is the tipping point, that the Republican Party was not a mainstream right party anymore and decided to move into that direction. and then it's still able to pull together all these different right-wing voters, although not all of them are far right-wing voters, but there is able to keep them together, so to say. And this is the most threatening scenario for a democracy, which, by the way, would be, for me, the most threatening scenario for Chile. Imagine that we run a primary, and because the different factions within the Chilean right are not able to develop a program, and they say, okay, let's run a primary, and we put our candidates there. And they decide to put Jose Antonio Cast there. And if they put many different candidates there, what we know is Jose Antonio Cast is able to mobilize his 10% very strongly. And it could be in theory that with his 10%, he ends up being nominated as the politician of the center right, although he's not the center right, he's the far right, so to say. This would be for me a very challenging scenario for the Chilean context. I am hopeful that this will not happen. But just to make the comparison with the United States, that's a bit what happened with Trump. Although, again, I think that Trump is the tip of the iceberg, and that process started way before Trump came to power.
Yeah, well, fascinating questions. It's wonderful to get your perspective and thinking about how these different cases fit within a larger, more comparative understanding of right-wing politics. So, Cristobal, it's been a real pleasure to have you here. We appreciate you joining us, and we thank everybody in the audience.